Hi there, welcome back to Bernina Club. So I'm going to show you today how to make some very nice fine piping, but we are going to make our own bias. So we're doing a proper bias binding and making it into fine piping. Then I'm going to show you how to make a wider piping, and we are going to make a mystery project for Bernina Club over the next 3 months. So we're going to start off first by teaching you how to make continuous binding, and we are making it into piping. So first things first, you don't need to waste a whole lot of fabric. So traditionally people get a nice big bit of fabric and they cut their fabric on the cross and they cut strips of fabric. This method, you don't need much fabric at all to get nearly 3 meters of binding or piping. So I've just got a piece of fabric here, and I am going to make sure that it is a square of fabric because you need to start off with a square. I'm going to press the fabric so it's got no creases in it, and I'm going to measure it to make sure that it is actually square before I start. So I'm just going to measure it on my little board here, and that is 13 3/4 that way. Oh, do I come down this way so it's the same? And that is 13 3/4 that way. So that is a nice square piece of fabric. I'm going to turn it over and I'm going to press it on the wrong side of the fabric. And if you want to check if it's square, if you haven't got a board, it's easier to check if you just put your fabric corner to corner and make sure that it is definitely a square before you start. So I'm going to come over to my iron and I'm just going to press this to make sure, and I've just got my trusty little craft iron here, which is very handy, and it's really all I need for this today. Don't need to have anything too drastic to press this, and my little iron can actually go up a little bit hotter, which I will do shortly for the next part. So give it a little press, and then you are going to just sit it on your board, and you're going to get your ruler. Now if you have a look on your ruler, you'll see there actually is a 45-degree angle on your rulers when you buy them, so you can lay that down the side and it will be exactly a 45-degree angle, which is what you want for a true bias anyway. So I'm just going from point to point. If you don't have a cutter and a board, I'm sure you've got a ruler, and you could just use a pencil and rule it down, and then you can cut it with the scissors. All right, but I've got my cutter, so I'm just going to make a nice clean cut like that, and then make sure it is a nice clean cut. And if it's not, just get those little nicks. Maybe I need a new blade, and pop that there. Right, now I am going to turn this over so you can see the fabric, and I'm turning it so I've got my 2 pieces of fabric like this. Okay, so all I do because I'm going to sew these together, is I'm going to take this piece and I'm going to lay it down on top of the other piece so it looks like a very strange shape. And if you have a look, if I lift this up, I'm going to be sewing this straight edge, and I should have 1/4 inch fabric out this end and 1/4 inch fabric excess out that end. So I'm sewing 1/4 inch down here, and that will then come out perfect. So if you want to, you can pin. Now if you're going to pin these together, you will want to put your pins with your heads of your pins sticking out like this, right? But I use clips, I hardly pin anything. And did you know that these little clips from Clover actually have little markings on them here and here? So they've got actually 1/4 inch markings on them as well. So it's quite good. You can actually pin them at the 1/4 inch seam where you're going to be sewing down. So either pins or clips. I don't use pins anymore really. I just use my clips, and I just put a couple of clips on there. Okay, so I have a choice of different feet that I could use, and if you have a look on my screen here, I'm going to tell my machine what foot that I'm using because I'm on a 790 plus today. So I'm just going to touch the picture of my foot, and I'm going to use, I could use a 37 foot, which is a 1/4 inch foot. I could use a 57 foot, which is a 1/4 inch foot with a guide, but I'm going to use my 97D foot, which is my 1/4 inch foot for this machine. So I'm just going to go to 0 to 9, and I'm going to go to 97, and it'll show me my 97 foot and my 97D. And I just highlight that, and then I can cross out of there, and I just leave everything the same, and now it's showing the correct foot that I'm using for my machine. So I'm going to take off my dual feed, and I'm going to take off my 1D foot, and I'm going to find my 97D foot, and I'm going to pop that on, and I can also put on my dual feed, and there you go. So I will check if I've got a bobbin in my machine. I have white in my thread, so in my bobbin, so I'm just going to leave that in because I don't need coloured thread. So I've got my white thread in there, and I'm going to put a white thread on top, and in my drawer I have got some white thread. So I'm using, this is my Gutermann here. So I've got some white Gutermann I'm going to use, and make sure your foot is lifted up when you thread your machine, and always make sure it's in the tension discs. Come down, turn around, and use your needle threader because it's fantastic. Okie doke. So I'm just going to sew from the top to the bottom. I'll get a little bit of fabric for a starter, some scrap fabric. And it's always good to start on there because you are going to be sewing right on the very edge, and you do not want your fabric to go down into your machine. So remember, these bigger machines have got a 9mm opening of their plate, and so sometimes your fabric will want to get eaten down in there. So if you start with a little bit of a starter here, you don't have to worry. And there's all my wonderful sounds of my machine. So I'm just stopping there. I've got my machine set with my needle stop down on. So now I'll just move that over so you don't have to look at that. And now I will just sew straight onto my fabric, and I don't have to worry about it eating into my work. So take my pin out, which I'm not using anyway. Make sure you've got your raw edges together. And sew down, and I can rearrange everything. My needle stops down, it's really, really good. And that noise is my cat trying to scratch through the glass door, which is pretty impossible. So good luck to that. So I'm now going all the way to the end. In fact, I will get a little bit of fabric to pop on the end. Makes life easier. And sew down to the bottom. Now, if your machine doesn't sound as quiet as this, give it an oil. It might be thirsty and it might be dirty. So people often say your machine's very quiet. Yeah, well, I oil it regularly. So I can now just cut my extra bit of fabric there, and cut my extra little bit of fabric here, and leave that piece under the machine for the next step. Now I'm going to open this out, and I'm going to press that seam completely open, which is what you don't normally do with patchwork, but you do it when you're making your bindings. So I'm just going to press that seam flat. So I will just open up my seam and press it flat all the way down, and turn it over and press it from the right side as well. And make sure, if you're using a fabric, especially a fabric like this with a metallic, that you can iron straight onto it. Some cheaper fabrics you may not be able to iron onto. Now, can you see I've got a nice long strip there? So this now is my true bias, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, on the wrong side, nearly did it wrong, I'm going to mark my width I would like my bias. Now, if you are making a piping that is very fat, like a number 4 piping cord, I will draw my lines about 1.5 inches. If I'm going to do a very fine piping cord, I will cut my strips 1.25 inches. So I'm going to do 1.5 inches today on this. So I'm going to get a pen, and it really doesn't matter what pen you use, mainly because you're going to be cutting these lines. So whether you've got a water erasable pen or a ballpoint pen, it really doesn't matter as long as you don't make a mistake. However, if you make a mistake, you want a pen that could be washed away with water or washed away with an eraser. So how this pen works is if I mark it and my marker's in the wrong place, can you see that nice and clearly? I have an eraser with it. These are called the Seline Duo markers and erasers, and I can actually erase my line without having to wet my fabric. I love it. And it's gone. So that's the beauty of having a water erasable or a duo marker, that you don't have to go to the water for. You could, but it has its own, they come in a pack like that. They're very good. So I use these a lot. So now my straight line here, my bias line, I'm going to turn my ruler over so I can read it. And I'm going to do 1.5 inch markings. And how you do that is you line up your little line with 1.5 inches. Oh, actually, if I'm really, really good, I'll put them on the line for you as well. I don't bother with that, but I will do it for you. But I use this, so I just line up my little lines, 1.5, 1.5, 1.5, all the way up. And now I just use my pen and I draw all the way down here and all the way down here. And you need these lines to be clear because they're going to be your cutting line later on. Now you bring this over and you put these markings, your 1.5 inch markings, on the line you've previously drawn. So it has to be really, really straight. So 1.5, 1.5, and check yourself and make sure you have done it correct. So, and you can tell by eyeballing it as well that you've done it right. Move this over so you can get the rest of your fabric in, and go to 1.5 again and draw your 1.5 inch markings. So originally I thought we'd do 1.25 for the project, but 1.5 is definitely much better. So I've changed it to 1.5 inch strips, and you are going to be very surprised how much binding you get out of that small amount of fabric. You get nearly 3 meters of binding. It's a brilliant method, and it's so much easier than wasting fabric. So 1.5, 1.5. Now when I get to the last one, if I've got any excess fabric, I'm not going to leave it. I'm going to cut it off so I don't have to worry about it being incorrect when I do the next step. So I'm going to get rid of that last little piece. I do not want that. Did I get that to the end? Yes, and that's going in the rubbish. Okay. Make sure you always close your cutters. Now here's the next step. So you have drawn your lines, they're all 1.5. You're now going to fold this. So you're bringing this up to here, and then you're turning it because you're going to match it up with these lines. Now, I'm going to sit down and show you this. You're not going to match the lines perfectly on the edge so that they're kissing each other like that. You're going to be making them cross over each other by 1/4 inch. So I'm going to try and explain this really, really well. So this end one should go past your seam by 1/4 inch so that when you sew it, there, where you start sewing it from here, 1/4 inch all the way down, that will be 1/4 inch from the edge of the fabric to the pin where you're going to sew. So you put a pin through there, and that should meet up with your seam exactly at the back. Okay? So now, when I do the next one, when I do the next one, and I come to match these up, I'm going to put a pin through here to show you. Can you see where the pin is? It's about 1/4 inch down from the raw edge of the fabric, and it's 1/4 inch down from here, and that will meet perfectly when I sew across here. Okay, so I need to do that to every single row. Quarter of an inch, quarter of an inch. And it should just happen. You shouldn't have to really think about it. So I'll just show you that. Can you see there? So my pin is exactly on the quarter of an inch and the pin is exactly on the quarter of an inch here. So they're crossed over like this. That's exactly what you want to do. So the quarter of an inch is where my crossover is. That's where we're sewing. Okay? And pin. So you have a whole piece of fabric sticking out the end, and you will have a whole piece of fabric sticking out this end. Okay? A quarter of an inch, and it just works. It's crazy. It just works. A quarter of an inch, and I believe I need small pins, which are in here, because I'm using a needle right this very second. So I've got some more pins in somewhere in here. I don't have to use a needle. This is my little needle nest I take to classes. It's really handy just for a few pins. And it's magnetised, so I don't have to worry about things dropping out. They're really cute. They're like $4. They're great. They're called needle nest. Take that out. And my last one, there's my excess fabric, like that. And this crossover needs to be a quarter of an inch from that edge. So I pull it over, and if I put my pin in, perfect. And that's where it needs to be. So it's really important that you do pin. Oops, I may have missed the fabric. It's really important that you do pin so that it will end up perfect. I've done enough fingers and thumbs. Here we are. So that last one you might just need to give it a little tweak. It always seems to be a little bit tighter, that last one, but that's fine because it works. Okay, so now remember I've got my quarter inch foot on, and I am going to stitch, and that end one too. It's both end ones, always need to have a bit of a pull. So now I'm going to stitch a quarter of an inch. So if you like, you can sew onto that piece of fabric and just start down here, and then you're already on the fabric. So needle down, take the pin out, make sure your raw edges are even, needle down, and give that first one just a little bit of an ease, and then the rest will just be perfect. So always the needle down function's great. If you do not have that function, turn your balance wheel so the needle is down before you pull the pin out, and then just make sure you're just pulling it along. Needle down, take the pin out. So you're just working along all the same. And it's amazing how this works. So you're basically making a tube of fabric, but it is becoming your new binding, and you can do this. You don't normally have to do a biased binding when you make a quilt because your quilt edges are square. However, if you did a quilt where you had a beautiful curve around your edges of your quilt, you would make a biased edging, all right? And I'm just getting my bit of fabric for the end. And I'm going to cut here, and I'm going to cut here, and I will show you what we've created. So it kind of looks a mess, and then just shake it out, and there you have made a tube. Okay, so all I do now is I press this seam open. Okay, so my next step is to press the seam open. Don't worry that I've used a pen that can heat set, because I'm going to be cutting it, so it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what pen I'm using, because it's going to be cut. That's my cutting line. Just do not use, here's a very good thought, do not use a friction pen, because if you do, you're going to iron it, and it's going to take away all your markings. Do not use a friction pen. That would be disastrous. In fact, be careful with those. They're not a good pen to use because they can actually mark your fabric and you can't get them off. So every time you go and iron your garment, your friction pen comes on. When it washes, it comes off and then it comes up again. So it's not a great pen to use for sewing. Okay. Righty-ho. There I have my seam and my seam. Now all I do, put my arm through here, get a nice good pair of scissors, and now all I do is cut around my lines, and I have made my true bias for either piping or for binding a quilt or for using on a garment to bind round a neck. This is just such a great thing to learn to make. And I remember doing this 20 odd years ago. But it's, I think we sometimes forget because people just use pre-bought bias. But for this project, you can't buy pre-bought bias because the project is using a thicker cord and the biases you buy are thin. So I'm going to show you how to sew your thin bias, but we are making a thick bias today, a 4mm cotton cord piping is what we're ending up with. So you see, you just follow around and around in a circle, and you have got a wonderful bias. So you can match up all your fabrics, you can match up your garments with matching pipings. It's good fun. So once you've learnt and you realise you're not having to waste a lot of fabric, I think you'll enjoy it. So I'm just going to cut all this, and then I'm going to measure this. So what did I say this was? 14 3/4 inches, which I will translate that into centimetres because we use inches when we are patchworking and sewing. A lot more than centimetres because all the patterns and patchwork is all inches still. So I'm just going to cut it because I would like to measure this length and tell you how much we've actually made. So you're going to make more than you're going to need for the project, but if you're like me, I've decided I'm making 2 of them because, yeah, it's really cool. So I'm making one out of old recycled jeans and the other I'm making out of a drill fabric and some of my matching fabrics that I like out of Cafe facet fabric. So I'm just going to cut this. Right, and there you have your true bias tape. It's brilliant. And how you know that is when you go here and you go to here, you've got that beautiful stretch, so it's all biased. So if I get my tape measure out, which I've put in a safe place, here it is here. So 14 3/4 inch of fabric, which is 37.5 centimetres, is going to make that's 1.40 m. Interesting length tape measure. £2.80 of binding. Isn't that brilliant? So I think that's great. So it's a really good saving of your fabrics. So when I store them, they either get wrapped around a old Glad wrap roll, or you can just wrap them up like this and you have got your bindings already for your next project. So what I've done here is I have made some binding. I'll just cut that bit off. I've made some binding, and I'd like to show you that if you do a stripe, how really great it looks when you have made a binding out of it. So this one is only 1 1/4 inches, and I'm going to use this to show you how to make a piping with it. So I'm just going to cut a little piece and I'm going to show you how to make a piping. Now I have a great foot that I use, and the foot that I use is called a number 23 foot, and it's one of my really old feet, and this has got like a little groove underneath which is only 2mm, so it's really good for satin stitching, but it's fantastic for sewing this piping. So it's actually a little piping foot, and it's foot number 23, and I have given you, or you can download the notes for it, which are on the website. Okay, so this foot, I'm now going to tell my machine what foot I've got on. So remember, on these machines you go to the picture of the foot and you go 0 to 9 and you go 23 and you touch on the foot and it tells you. Some of the other machines you can just put the foot on and it will recognise that foot's okay for you to use because it's a straight stitch foot. So I'm going to put my needle up. It's saying I haven't got the right foot on because I haven't taken this foot off yet, actually, machine. So I'm going to put the needle up and the foot up, and it's saying I've jammed my machine. So if that actually happened, I would put my hand wheel up and I would lift this across and I would take this foot off. No idea, maybe I just confused it. And I would take my bobbin case out. And I would take my bobbin out and I would re-put that in. I wouldn't just carry on if I saw a picture of cogs up on my screen. Then what I would do, this is good to show you, I would cut my thread and I would pull my thread from the top down and I would re-thread my machine again, and then I would put the correct foot on to make sure that my machine was happy. I wouldn't just carry on like a bull in a china shop, as the saying goes, and just expect my machine to go. So this foot doesn't have an opening, so I'm going to put my needle through my foot, and I'm going to pull my thread down and then put my foot on. Okay, and now the machine is happy, it's got the right foot, there's no cogs, so I know that whatever I'd done before is fine. And now I'm just going to start by stitching. And now this is interesting because I'm going to be putting this piping cord, which is 2 millimeters wide, underneath this foot. So after the break, I'm going to explain how you know that that's the right size cord to actually use with this foot. So in fact, I'm going to take my foot off and I'm going to show you that. So I will see you in just a minute.